Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be making a really exciting dress. So this was something on my mind for a while and now I figured I would do it. So I got this beautiful beaded flowery fabric and that pink fabric underneath. So these were both really expensive, so I couldn't get as much as I wanted to. I had to work with the materials I had, but it turned out really beautiful. And I'm just going to show you the process that I used for this. So because the pink fabric underneath, that's going to become underneath the flowery fabric anyway, this pink fabric has a little bit of a stretch to it, but it's also really delicate. It's kind of like a satiny. And some of my pins are a bit older, so not as sharp, which means they leave little holes behind. Which on most fabrics doesn't matter, but because this fabric is so delicate, I decided to trace it out with chalk, and here we go. These are all the pieces. So I've got two side pieces, a center front that is on the fold, so I traced it out twice, and then two back pieces. And now I'm just going to be cutting these out. So I'm just being nice and careful. My rotary cutter recently broke, otherwise I would have used that to cut these pieces out. But this actually works really well. Just go nice and slow and get it all cut out. And I was so excited with this whole process. It was just so exciting. And it's so shiny, that fabric. Oh, I love the shine of it. Just about this pattern, I will link it down below in the description box. But if you want to, you can also make this pattern yourself. You can do this by creating, there's like a lot of videos on this, but you can wrap the doll up in tape and you can make custom patterns from there. So I actually took the pattern I used from the mannequin to make that one, and I adjusted it, stuck them together, and actually made it into a proper pattern, unlike the mannequin, which had heaps of darts because I didn't actually refine it that much. So this is what we end up with when everything is cut out. And like I mentioned, it's a delicate fabric, so instead of pinning this, I'm avoiding using pins as much as possible, and I'm going to be basting these in place first. So with these front curves, I do use a couple of pins, as little as possible, but I do use a few pins just to help me get around the curve without it moving. And I am going from the bottom to the top because that was just easier. And here you go, me just including the pins. So this basting I'm using some white cheap thread. So this thread really breaks easily. It is not worthy to put into a sewing machine because of the delicateness. It really breaks easily. Hence, this is just done to baste it in place and just do it nice and close to the edge so you can easily remove it once it needs to be removed. And I'm just going to do this for all the pieces. So the side front to the center front, on both sides, and then I'm also using the back pieces. I'm going to sew the sides together, so where the armhole is, I'm going to be attaching those. And with everything based in place, we're just going to be sewing down each of these seams. Just a little warning though, I got really excited and I sewed down all these seams, but yeah, I kind of forgot I'm sewing in miniature, and sewing this in miniature, like compared to sewing real life size for me, I wouldn't have sewn those sides closed. And this is mostly because I still needed to include the sleeve. But I didn't think about that, I was just too excited and I wanted to sew the bodice together. But if you are planning on making this with me, and you are planning on adding sleeves like I am, then I recommend that you don't sew that side seam together, so that's the one that attaches to the back piece, and instead you just leave those separate and then sew the shoulders together, which I'll sew together in a moment. So yeah. Anyway, if you are following me or not, at this point you can pull out those basting stitches, and if you did them close enough to the edge, they pull out really easily and they are not included within that seam allowance. So that is just so satisfying, and I love pulling this out. It's a bit of work to baste them in place, but pulling these out is just so nice. Here you go, that was a little bit harder. And once this was all done, I decided to overlock these seams separately. So I can fold them open flat and iron these after everything. So here we go, I've overlocked it, this is what it's looking like. I've gone ahead and ironed it, as well as clipped into those curves at that bust seam. This is just to make it look flatter and lay more smoothly. It's really important with those really curved seams to cut those. So now I'm going to be sewing my shoulders, and yes, I still haven't realized my mistake. I'm just too excited. And I'm also basting this in place, just like the other pieces. And then I'm going to be sewing that with the seam allowance that I gave myself. In this case, on the pattern, it was a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This just gives me enough space to work with. If you find that this is too bulky, you can always cut this shorter. And I'm just continuing the same way, but now I'm using my beautiful flowery fabric. So I've laid it out exactly where I want it to be. In this case, I had an idea of having this really nice flowers centered around the centerpiece, and that's just how I did it. So I pinned this in place so it wouldn't shift, and I can cut around the pattern piece. So I also laid this out just to have the pink underneath. So I shifted it around a few times before I settled on a design. And this is what I came up with. I'm also being really careful not to cut through the flowers because I wanted to save those flowers so I can use them later on if that's what I wanted to do. And I'm just saving all of those, and I end up putting them in a cup. And these are the pieces that I came up with. So less flowers on these side pieces just to balance it out, and then more flowers on the front and the back pieces. The hard bit about this is these are beaded. So unlike lace, you can't really sew through beads. So I removed around a centimeter's width of all of this, since that's the seam allowance of the beads, to the best that I could, because I don't really want to try sewing over those. It's gonna ruin my needle, if not break it. So this is, I really hate it. I'm just gonna be honest, I did not like working with the beaded fabric. It was really beautiful, but working with it was really hard. What you can also do is, rather than sew the whole base together like the pink bodice that I just made, you can baste it all the way around, so you can have this one attached to the pink seam and then you can have it, but I really wanted it to be a separate layer because I felt like it would lay more smoothly rather than basting it together first. And sewing this, I just went really nice and slow, and at some point I decided I was too scared and I just used it, just twisted it by hand. This is sped up, don't worry, I was not sewing this fast. It was actually really hard to sew this fabric, so don't be afraid to twist the needle by hand, just using that hand crank, because it comes in handy with this. And don't forget to reverse at the beginning and the end, because you don't want the thread to come undone. Now, I just repeat this for all the things, and I am actually going to be trimming down these seams. This is because it's a sheer fabric, so this is where it can come in handy just to attach it to the pink, because now I had some notable seams. I tried thinking of this project, tried thinking it through, but apparently I didn't enough until I ran into a certain problem like this. So I decided to trim the seams down. I still haven't realized I probably should have not sewn that side seam, but oh well, I trimmed down the seams and I'm working with it. This just means that I'm going to be sewing the sleeves in by hand, which I'll notice at some point and get to at some point. Yes, I think it was at this point actually that I realized my mistake, but I had already trimmed down I had already trimmed down the seam allowance, so there was no going back. So I'm just patterning the sleeves here. So if you haven't noticed yet, I really wanted to make cape sleeves. And I was so excited to get this. I had to make it really nice and long, reach the floor length. So I just measured from her top of the shoulder to her feet and just gave it a bit more because seam allowance. So I started by making that length first and making the bottom just a straight line there. And I'm just taking a sleeve pattern, just a basic pattern. I took this from the Sequoia jacket. I don't know if I'm saying that right or if that's correct. but it was originally a 3-piece sleeve that you're supposed to sew together. I just cut the pattern and I stuck the pieces together, so I came out with this pattern piece. I found out how to make a cape sleeve, and they were saying to measure your sleeve and then divide it by 2. In this case that was 3.7, and I just rounded that up to 4 centimeters, just giving me a little bit more, which I didn't mind. So I'm just drawing around the sleeve, starting from that corner. You can also fold the paper if you've got enough room, but I just went with half. And I'm just marking where that mark was, the 4 centimeters. This is actually going to be your notch, and you're going to be sewing up to this point. And then I also marked how wide I wanted it to be. I just guesstimated, and I decided that that looked about right, because it's kind of like how you would make a paneled circle skirt. That was the idea behind it, but instead of making a circle skirt, I just made it a sleeve. This turned out really beautiful, and I am in love with cape sleeves. I like really nice sleeves in general. I'm a fan of fun sleeves. Like, just give me fun sleeves and I'm happy. A bishop sleeve, I'm there. You want to give me a flowy, fluttery short sleeve? I'm there. Like a puffy sleeve? Yeah, I'm all for it. I like my sleeves. Okay, rant over. I'm just rounding out the corner, just like you would do for a circle skirt, because I had that in mind. But you know, sleeve. And then I'm cutting it out. So it's actually really easy. You can just decide your own width. You can make it as wide or as narrow as you want it, as long as that top piece is kind of curved. But even that you can wing if you don't have a pattern piece. So yeah, this is what it looked like. So all cut out from my fabric, and ooh, it's so satisfying. And just because the bodice had these flowers, I looked through the pieces that I still had left, and I found some really nice flowery pieces, and I'm going to be stitching these in place. So I'm actually using a matching thread, and I'm going to be stitching these very strategically in place as best as I can. So the top there can be a bit rougher since it's going to be sewn into the sleeve anyway. But all the way around the bottom bits, I did do it nice small neat stitches. And unfortunately you do see it on the back, but as long as it's on there, you don't actually notice these stitch marks on the back of the sleeve. And I'm saying this because it's a cape. You can see the back of these sleeves. Like if she were to put her arm up, you can see the back of these sleeves. So just be aware of that. I did try to keep it as neat as possible, but this is just a bit harder sometimes. So yeah, be aware if you're planning on doing this with the extra bead of fabric. If not, it still looks beautiful. Anyway, this just takes a lot of time, and I'm being very careful to sew this in place. And this is what I ended up with. So they are sewn in place. I tried to keep it as neat as possible, and I realized I should have ironed these sleeves because they're a little bit creasy. Anyway, we're going to be putting those sleeves to the side for just a moment and continue with the bodice. So you should now have a pink bodice, a flower bodice, and I've gone ahead and made a lining bodice. And this lining is also just a normal cotton fabric. This is just also chosen because it would give it a little bit more strength, which worked out really well, so recommend that. So I'm just going ahead lining up these two pink layers, the pink layer and the flower layer, and I'm lining these up because I'm going to be basting these in place. So I just made a small mark with the pins, just leaving that pinned at the shoulder seams just to make sure it would line up. And I'm just going to be basting this with a quick running stitch all the way around, so up one side, across the top there, down the other side, and then also along the bottom. This really makes it easier when you're attaching the skirts, so recommend doing that. And once you've done that, you're also going to run a quick running stitch across the sleeve, the armhole I mean, because we're going to be attaching the sleeve. And don't forget to clip off any of the extra threads that are still there. Important to keep doing that. And this is what we're at so far. And now we're going to grab those sleeves that we just made, and it's time to attach them. So I'm just taking my pattern and I'm looking for that little mark that I made before. This is to symbolize to where I need to sew it to. So I'm just using it to mark on the sides there with a piece of chalk, and I'm also marking the center because I want to line it up. I don't want to accidentally have one side too much and then the other side not enough. So I'm just finding the center and lining that up with the shoulder seam. And because I had attached all these fun pieces, I decided to hand sew this in place. It's not ideal, I know. I wasn't very happy when I kind of realized, but at the same time, I was okay with it because these beads made it really hard to sew with the sewing machine. So I just made the choice to sew this by hand, and later on I just decided to sew more of it by hand because it was just easier. So I'm just using a back stitch to sew this in place, and just doing that from the center to one side and then going back to the center, doing down the other side. It was the easiest way that I could think of, just to keep it nice and even and know where to end it. And this is what we have. And you can remove your basting stitch if that's what you want. And I'm still here sewing, 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 sewing. It's a lot of sewing, don't you think? Okay, and not enough. Anyway, I'm just going down the other side like I mentioned before. And once you've done this, your sleeve is almost done. Just a little side note, I do recommend hemming this first, like doing the bottom and the sides, because I did it afterwards, which was fine, just a little bit harder at those little pieces, like the armhole where you've just sewed it in. I didn't think of it until literally just now as I'm doing this voiceover, that if you had hemmed it first, like I am showing you here now, it was actually easier. So I've just done a nice double fold over and a running stitch. And if you're doing a running stitch, I do recommend just making a little secure knot in the back there every so often. But this is what it looked like. And I decided to do this by hand because I didn't want to do this by machine, as it would really pucker a bit, as you can see on some of the other pits. So yeah, I did this by hand. Like a lot of things that I'm going to be doing shortly by hand. And now that we have these pieces, I have gone ahead and done a really quick basting to hem the armholes. And this is because I wanted to line it. And because these sleeves are not fully around, but cape sleeves, so they stop at the top and they don't do the bottom bit, it means there's a really ugly bit. So yeah, I looked up how to do this properly, but I just couldn't figure it out. So I decided after all of this and taking a long break that I was just going to do a quick basting around these armholes, folding the fabric to the inside, just like I did on my lining piece, so I can sew the two pieces together. So I'm going to be attaching the lining as I usually would, and then at the end I'm going to be sewing the armholes together so the purl seams are on the inside. So this is what we have now, and I'm just going to leave it at that for now, because we're going to be attaching the lining first. So attaching the lining, I like to have, of course, right sides together, but I like to match the shoulder seams first, because if done properly, these shoulder seams should line up the best, and then the rest should line up from there. And then you can also find your sides and your center front. And at this point I am pinning it, and I am also going to be basting it. I'm just being very careful with my pins, making sure I choose the sharper lot, like they're newer and less used, rather than the other ones, because I just had to pin this in place. But yeah, it actually worked out fine. You don't see any of this. I was just being really careful with the whole pinning thing up until now, as you can see. And I have sewed that in place. I removed the basting already, and I'm just going to be clipping those corners, as well as this little center piece on the inside. And I'm just cutting a little triangle from the center. I did wonder whether or not I should overlock these seams. I do end up overlocking the sides, but not the top there. And that is mostly done because the sides will get a bit of straining, but the top there, once it's top stitched, it should be fine. It was not really fraying that much anyway. And this is what it would look like. So I'm just pushing out those corners there and making it nice and sharp because we like our sharp edges. And I'm just going to be pushing this to the inside. And once you've done that, it is time to, I'm doing a running stitch, but time to top stitch it. You can do this by machine, but yeah, I was really getting tired of the beads at this point. So I'm continuing by hand. And you'd be surprised that I chose to sew by hand rather than machine, but yeah, imagine how tired I was getting of the beads. You can also, at this point, or like before touching the lining, if there were any spots that were really desperately needing more beads, if you had to remove beads, for example, you can add those back on. I think I added 1 or 2, but it's too much hassle. And I didn't notice that much there where I was missing those beads. Anyway, I'm just going to be measuring out the length of the bodice. This ended up being 8 centimeters for me, and it's time to continue with the skirt. So just a little side note, I really wanted the skirt to be floor length, but the initial width that I got was like a quarter of a meter, I think. Because it was an expensive fabric, so I had to watch how much I got. This width didn't allow me enough room for her to go from the waist to her feet. So I had to use it lengthways, but I also had long sleeves. So this didn't leave as much fabric as I would have liked. My original design had the idea of using like a half circle skirt or even a full circle. Yeah. I don't have that much fabric. The amount that I had was this width, which I tried bringing volume in by making small pleats, as you can see, although I feel like I should have just gathered it. I was just really tired of this project at this point. I wanted it done, and I was just really annoyed that I didn't have enough fabric to make the skirt that I wanted. But it turned out alright. You have to work with what you've got. And I'm just using the last of my beautiful, flowery, lacy, beaded fabric and just adding that to the top. And I did this for several reasons, because it had this really nice edge that I wanted to include, as well as the fact, same thing for the sleeves, is that the whole bodice has the flower, so I just wanted it to go into the skirt a bit before having just a normal pink fabric. Yeah, it turned out okay. It does bunch a bit because I didn't actually have enough. I already had to piece 2 pieces together, and it was, yeah, I think if I had more of this fabric, I could have played around with it more, but like I mentioned, it was so expensive, but I had fallen in love with it, so I really had to get a piece, and I'm so happy that I did, because I got to make this awesome dress. But yeah, working with more fabric is always easier, but sometimes you just gotta do with what you have. So this is just what I'm doing. And I'm basting this in place so I can attach it with the sewing machine to the main bodice. And yes, I'm just leaving this basted in place, and I'm also going down the 2 sides. I do decide to pin this together to sew up the back seam first, and I'm going to be hemming up the top. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm just lining up the top, mostly because my hem wasn't even yet. I hadn't decided the final length. Well, I had roughly, but you know, it's not even. Anyway, so I just pinned the top first, and then I removed the very top pin because I wanted to leave that gap open. And I just chose a random amount, honestly. I just figured that would give me enough room to get over her booty before anything else. And probably did. I probably could have sewn up a bit more, but yeah, it's fine. I don't mind it at all. And like I've been doing throughout this whole project, I'm using a basting stitch before sewing this in place. So I've sewed this, and I'm removing that basting stitch, and I have also gone ahead and overlocked those side seams. And I'm just grabbing a matching thread and slightly off matching. I ran out of the other one that matched a lot better. But I ran out of it and gotta do what I gotta do. It's the back, nobody sees the back. As long as the sleeves are hemmed with the correct piece, I'm fine with it. So I'm just folding this over once and I'm carefully sewing this in place. And I'm doing a running back stitch. You know how usually with a back stitch you have one really nice clean side that shows the really nice stitches and then the other side where you ended up going back every time? Yeah, my really nice beautiful looking stitches were on the inside while the not so nice looking bit is on the outside. It's fine, I'm adding grommets so you don't actually notice it. But here I'm just showing, you can also see it a bit because the thread color was off. But you don't actually notice that in the end, so I'm okay with it. I was just still bothered by the fact that this skirt's gonna be as full as I wanted it to be. You know, like a ball gown. I want it to be full. I have gone ahead and stitched those sleeves to the lining like I mentioned I would do. I forgot to film that and I'm sorry about that. But I'm just going to be attaching the skirt now. So the reason I've hemmed it now is because that way we don't have a really ugly seam at this point that we still need to hide on the inside of the bodice. So this is just the easier bit. So I'm pinning the two sides and this is actually why we measured it first. So we knew to what length we needed to make the skirt. You can also just grab it every time and remeasure. But especially if you're going to be hemming before touching it, you want to make sure that it is the right length. Yeah, I still wonder if I should have gathered the skirt. As you can see here, it was starting to really become poofy. I hadn't ironed it yet because reasons. I don't think it would have helped much anyway. And this is what we have. So, that bodice and those sleeves, they're beautiful and I love them. So just turn that skirt inside out, cut it to the right length, hemming time, all of that fun stuff, you know, hemming, a favorite part of every project. Totally, that's right, a favorite part. And we're going to be adding some grommets. And once you've added these and done the hem, you are finally done. And I'm so happy with how she turned out and I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps my channel out. Leave a comment down below on ideas and any questions you might have and I'm happy to answer those. And I will see you all next time. Bye!